Okay, so we should be recording, and I've got my slides up. So please do not interrupt this presentation, because for one thing, you may pop up on the screen, which means you'll be recorded. So we want to avoid that if possible. And I want to stay on track with all this good information that I'm going to give you tonight. And then I'm going to open it up for questions. I'll actually stop intermittently and ask if people have any questions as we go, because there's a lot of information here that could be a little bit overwhelming, where we're going to take some breathing space as we go. So my specialty is in working with developmental trauma. And I happened into the field of psychedelics a few years ago when I did my very first MDMA journey. And that completely changed the course of my life. So I have been inspired and passionate about bringing this to others. And specifically around this the topic of the healing that we need to do in order to have fulfilling lives. Okay, I just want to say this is, maybe somebody can help me here, because I'm having a hard time. I might have to turn my audio down, because I'm getting a really bad echo in my ear as I'm talking. So if I'm tripping over myself, that's why. Okay, so we're going to talk about complex PTSD, which is really developmental trauma. And we're going to talk about a whole spectrum of things this evening, which may be a little bit much. So I'm trying to cover a lot of ground. So we're going to be talking on a very basic level, which is a relational somatic. So when we're dealing with developmental trauma, some of the major research that's been happening over the past decade has been about the impact of trauma as children growing up, the impact that trauma has on our nervous system. So we want to be really relating to trauma and to the suffering, which we're talking about, like anxiety, depression, and a variety of other symptoms, from a relational and somatic viewpoint. So that's going to be the basis of the work that we do tonight. Then the second leg of this three-prong approach that we're going to look at tonight is we're going to bring psychedelics into the work. And then on top of that, we're going to bring in, which is for me one of the most exciting areas that I've discovered over the past year, has been actually working and beginning to work in the area of the soul work. So we're going to go into just basics, like what is complex PTSD, the symptoms and causes, our attachment styles, and why we need to specifically heal in relationship. So many of us are familiar. If we've been around the psychedelic community for a while, we're very familiar with the many different psychedelics out there and the way that they're being used. So for many of us, we go into ceremony, we go into, for example, ayahuasca circles, we do out-of-body experiences, we use MDMA, we use psilocybin. In terms of the research, it's really like a one-on-one or a single one-off journey. So that's what we're most familiar with. But what's been spoken to less is the use of psychedelics in combination with the relational healing. So that's what we're going to talk about more tonight. And we're also going to talk about how we bring in the elements of soul into all of this groundwork. So when I talk about soul, I'm talking about the ways that we get to track our bigger than life experience as who we are as a person, as a greater than this ego lifetime at this moment in time. We're going to begin to get a continuum of who we are as a soul through time, essentially. And the relationship of the trauma that we grow up with in relationship to our soul's journey, which is some of the most exciting work for me at the moment. Because there's so much material here, as I was getting into developing this, I realized that I'm never going to do this in the time that we have. And so I got panicked a little bit, and I contacted Jason. I said, could we do a part 2? So over the next few weeks, we're going to do a part 2 of this whole experience on August 6th, and that'll be posted on the meetup as well. So tonight we're going to really be focusing on the first 2 legs with a little bit on the soul piece, and then on August 6th we're going to be summarizing what the relational part, the somatic part, and the psychedelic part, and then bringing more into the area of the soul work. So just think of this as a 2-part process. So me, just so that you know, I had a 20-year eating disorder. After I went through my own healing with that, it became very apparent that underlying that was a huge amount of despair, depression, anxiety, mania. So I had a lot of stuff going on. At that time, we didn't know what that was. It's obvious today that that was symptomatic of complex PTSD. But I went on and studied, had many decades of study in somatic psychology and transpersonal psychology, spiritual psychological trainings of all sorts. I founded a program, a spiritually based eating disorder program, which I ran for about a decade. And then I completed it. It was done. That was over. And a part of that was because I felt like I could do as much as I could do with the tools that were available at the time. And so I ended up doing my own dark night of the soul and traveled around. And it wasn't until then I happened upon my first MDMA journey that I found my next chapter, which is where we are right now. And it's ever evolving, and it's incredible work. So I am coming from this basic theoretical premise. So I want you to keep this in mind, which is not something that we hear very much about, which is that developmental trauma is actually a situation our soul chooses for lesson learning, growth, and evolution. And that the family system is a stage upon which each member of the constellation gets to play out its healing necessities. So that relationships are the forum that's needed to, first of all, create the wound, and second of all, to heal from it. And this is going to be important. We're going to come back to this because in the context of somatic relational work, the stuff that's going on in psychology today with the healing and what we know about young children growing up in families that are not supportive as they need to be, the focus is very much on this life. So this is, I've talked about this in other presentations. I'm just going to very briefly show you it's another triangular interweaving of ways of working. So the psychological, the way I view it and perceive it, is that it is the work of preparing our physical, mind-body physical container to house our spiritual essence. So that means when we've been traumatized as children, something is disrupted in that container. And that's why there are parts of ourself that actually don't get incorporated into the container. So the other part of the work is what I'm going to call shamanic soul work, which is the work of actually identifying these aspects of soul that need to be brought in to this container. And then the third leg of this model is the model of alchemical light work, where what we're actually doing is transmuting the density of our physical container to hold more and more light of our soul. So we've got these 3 legs operating, and what happens, I think, in the collective is that most people are going to be focused more on here. So when we're healing from trauma, we're going to get mostly focused in the psychological realm. And many of us can get caught and go round and round and spit around and round in the psychological area, not realizing that this is just the container that holds the deeper work, the other parts of us that need to come in. So we're preparing this so that we can actually begin to open up and receive more of our soul and know who we are as a soul so that we can fulfill our soul destiny. So developmental trauma, basically, simply put, developmental trauma is a disruption in our ability to experience well-being and to connect with ourselves and others due to early childhood neglect and or abuse. So Lawrence Heller and Aline Lapierre, their model, NARM, which is neuroaffective relational model, what they say in this book, which I'm going to warn those of you who have serious developmental trauma issues, this is a very triggering book to read, so you want to be careful, but it's extremely impactful and very rich in educational understanding of what goes on at the developmental phases. So basically what they're saying is a core NARM principle is that the capacity for connection with both self and others defines our emotional health. So how do we know we're emotionally healthy? We're connected to ourselves and we can connect with others. This is a beautiful chart, makes it very succinct that there are 5 core needs that connect to these core capacities for essential well-being. And they are, again, the first one is connection. So when the earliest rupture that we can have as an infant is in that place where we're bonding with mother, if there's a disconnect there, our capacity to connect gets disrupted. And then on top of that, we're building developmentally. We're trying to build developmentally on top of that. And these skills, if they're not in place, then we end up building defensive patterns, which we're going to get to in a minute. But we need the capacity to connect with ourself, with our emotions, to connect with others. We need the capacity to attune to our own needs and emotions, to connect, to recognize our capacity to recognize, reach out for, and take in a physical and emotional nourishment. So many times people aren't able to, even though they're surrounded by others who are caring for them or loving them, they're not able to receive that. There's the capacity to trust, which is developing healthy interdependence. There's the capacity for autonomy, to set appropriate boundaries, capacity to say no and to set limits, to speak our mind without guilt or fear. And there's the capacity then to engage with an open heart in loving relationships. So when these are interrupted, we experience anxiety, depression, and other symptoms of developmental trauma. This is an amazing book. If you haven't already read it, I'm going to highly recommend Your Resonant Self by Sarah Payton. As humans and social animals, we all pattern our brains on the brains that are closest to us when we are tiny. Infancy is the time when our neurons are developing and figuring out where to connect and how to grow. So we learn about relationship, what it means, and how to do it from the way that we are loved or not loved, responded to or ignored. Basically, we're loved back the way that we are loved. So this was something that, again, as I developed and I worked on my own healing, became more and more apparent, my own attachment wound. I didn't have this relationship with my mother actually was raised in a family where I never felt a bond with my mother at all. So as I've grown over the years and over the decades, I've come to understand more and more how crucially important it is to have this. That when we are held with adoration and attunement as an infant, we know we are protected and safe in every cell of our body. But without that holding and adoration, we grow up terrified of the world and angry, and we don't know why. So I just want us to take a minute, take a breather here, because this is going to be, some of this information is going to be a little bit triggering for some of you. There's a lot of people on the call where everybody's at different levels in their process of healing. So just be really careful as you're listening to this material. Maybe check in and notice if you're being triggered, and take care of yourself. So one of the things that we do is, in the process of becoming an adult, when we don't have this adoration and attunement, is we learn to disconnect. So many of us learn how to just listen mentally so we can experience this presentation as a bunch of information, and then tomorrow wake up and go, whoa, what happened? I'm feeling very dysregulated. So just want you to keep that in mind for a moment and really sink into yourself here. Take some deep breaths. And know that it's okay to have your experience, whatever it is. And with the understanding that I'm going to be throwing out this is a lot of information coming at you all at once. I'm in my 6th, 7th decade, right? And this is right here, still pieces that I'm working with. Very, very much so. Another beautiful quote from Sarah Payton: people cannot thrive unless they are looked at with delight. So in the context of working with psychedelic, and something I don't see a lot of talk about. So again, we're doing self journeys, or we're doing journeys in ceremony where we're lying in a group of people, or we're sitting in a group of people. But it isn't very often that we get to have this. So this connection, this such an amazing connection here between the eyes, and also notice the skin contact. Stephen Porges, a researcher in the area of somatic relational work, actually the one who developed the polyvagal theory. Feeling safe is the treatment. We get safety from this. When we get this, we feel every cell in our body feels nurtured, loved, and attuned to. If we don't get this, what happens is it's replaced with an emptiness, aloneness, fear, and anger. Feeling safe is the treatment. So this is based on the contemporary research of Stephen Porges. Well-being depends on positive interaction on the ventral vagal level, which calms the amygdala and establishes safe and nurturing connection. This level of interaction takes place with the heart, the voice, the facial expressions, just as baby to mommy, right? And when there's this somatic disconnect with mother, this attunement system doesn't mature adequately. So healing involves reinstating this attunement system. We're finding, because of the ability of the brain to rewire neurogenesis, we're able to actually begin to bring this in. And now with the use of psychedelics, this is even more potent, this work. So personally, again, this was a very important part of my own healing. First, on a macro dose of mushrooms, I was given the experience of somatic bonding and a secure relationship with my partner, which I had never felt before in my life. And I remember when it happened, it was, oh, there's some part of me that knew this was almost like an infantile merging, but that I had never experienced it. So there was very deep healing on that level. That's one of the ways that we can use psychedelics in the work, in the healing work that we do, with the right person, of course. But secondly, what happened after that was I started to notice that once that was more beginning to become deeply ingrained, that there was something else that was happening on even very small microdoses. And what was happening was that I was being given an inner sight or an inner understanding of actually the original causes of that lack of embodiment or that lack of nurturing with my mother. So when I began to come to see that the infantile experience that I had was not the beginning. So that's what we're leading up to here. But it is a very important part that needs to be corrected. So to understand trauma a little bit more, so we can really understand what's happening on a bigger perspective, is that when trauma happens, whether it's in that infant stage or whether it's later in time when we're 3 or 4 years old, or 18 for that matter, when we're bullied or when we're maybe in a car accident, whatever it is, when that trauma hits us, that part of us that is developing gets frozen in time. And the nervous system goes into a collapse, it goes numb, it gets hypervigilant. But the main thing to understand is that split off part creates an absence of awareness. So just like I explained when I had that experience of merging somatically with my partner, I had not been aware that that had been missing. There was an absence of awareness on that level. So whenever we're dealing with trauma, we are dealing with actual absence of awareness of these capacities that we should have had, but don't have. So when these split off parts become bigger or become the majority of who we are, we become very absent to ourselves. And then as a society and as a collective, what's happening is then we're building structures or institutions on absence of awareness. So we're all getting together, right, in our traumatized bodies and with these absences of awareness, and we're creating cultural institutions that are based on absence of awareness. So we're not even aware that we're not aware. And this is what I'm going to be calling the trance. So moving forward, as we begin to look at this and what's happening, I'm going to be talking about the trance. The trance is basically the collective absence of awareness that we get born into. So we live in a society where the absence of awareness of what it means to be connected to ourselves and others in an authentic way is normalized. So the absence of awareness or disconnection becomes normalized in our corporate structures, for example, based on the patriarchal power system, based on the Newtonian science that we've been raised in, So what we're dealing with is the emphasis on success, on domination, on consumerism, on collecting things becomes more important than the connection with each other. And this is the ocean, so to speak, that we're all being born into. And this is the ocean from which psychology has also arisen. Westernized society has arisen in this, out of this trance-like collective structure. So just briefly, I'm not going to go into this. It's all over the place to look up attachment styles. What we're talking about here is that, again, depending on what happened as we were little, we're developing certain attachment styles. At my website, I have included a chart in the psychedelic, so you can go onto the homepage of my website and you can get these psychedelic worksheets. I actually have a chart which goes into each one of these attachment styles, talks about what needs to happen for each style to come more into balance in relationship, and then also how to use the psychedelics as part of that healing process. So that is on the website. But just to know right now that secure attachment is what heals. So even if we weren't born with secure attachment, if we can form a secure attachment in our life, there's going to be an enormous amount of healing that starts to happen. You know, I want to say a little bit more about that. So even though the relationship might not be ideal, for example, if it's secure, it's good. So that's something to keep in mind. Whatever secure attachment that we have, we want to use to help us begin to heal this sense of disconnection. Okay, the symptoms of all of that, they're all of our symptoms. Addictions, eating disorders, disconnection from feelings, perfectionism, workaholism, lack of good boundaries, codependency, depression, anxiety, ADD, problems in relationships, obviously, negative self-talk, disgust, self-loathing, shame, bullying, racism, ageism. It's all coming out of this culture that's in the trance of disconnection. And of course, we're ending up in recreating or continuing to create these unaware social institutions until we begin to break the trance, break out of the trance. So going over the cause, here it is: childhood neglect and abuse, parents who are unable to be present, parental dysregulated nervous systems, because even if they're trying to be present, but if they have their own dysregulated nervous system, as babies, we're going to take on that dysregulation. And the one thing we're adding here is the fragmented or unsupported social system that we're born into. That is going to contribute to developmental trauma as well. I think I've gone into enough of this, but the thing I want to emphasize about this here, because this is going to lead into the piece around the soul work, is that because we live in the traumatized, frozen culture as Westerners, we're actually looking through, our systems are looking through the lens that we have to remember is limited in its own way. So we're looking through a lens of disconnection. And while we're getting better, hopefully, there still is that limitation. So the work of Stan Grof was groundbreaking because of his research with LSD, but he actually found a crack in this collective viewpoint. And what he discovered was that the baby at birth, that everything perinatal, everything around birth, was in utero, birth trauma itself or after birth, right, was actually a portal not only into the experiences of this life, but actually the experiences in the other realm. So going the other way, the space, so to speak, from which the baby has come into this life. So that birth trauma or that birth canal is a huge portal that we get to work on from both ends. Birth impacts this life, and my big question was then, what impacts birth? Okay, so we've just added perinatal, prenatal birth trauma to our list of causes. So we're going to look at this question again, what is developmental trauma? And I want to look at it again through the understanding of the lens of our disconnected, enculturated trance. So attachment theory and somatic research, while extremely important, we're making a huge assumption. And what the assumption that we're making is that our issues in this life originate in this life. So I'm proposing that developmental trauma may originate from a source that's actually a lot larger, mysteriously, and typically not understood in our culture. Okay, so how do we heal? So we've covered a lot of ground. We have this vagus nerve that is the center of our attunement capacity. We can actually begin to work it ourselves. So we can work our vagus nerve, we can expand its capacity, we can focus on our diaphragmatic breathing, we can do humming and toning, we can laugh, we can splash cold water on our face, we can activate our facial muscles. So there are things that we can do to begin to activate and expand the capacity of our vagal system. But I find that this is very it's very important. The statement by Dan Siegel, who's the clinical professor of psychology at UCLA School of Medicine. Science reveals clearly that our social world directly shapes how our neural firing unfolds. These studies illuminate how we help one another regulate our internal states through attuning to the internal state of the other person as part of what is called mutual regulation. So not only do I benefit from this attuning my body or allowing my somatic experience to calm by being in connection with somebody else who is already more regulated, but that person benefits as well. So there's a mutual regulation that happens. And that explains so much as to why I became a therapist, because I knew I could not regulate my own system, but as soon as I sat down with my clients, my system was regulated. So this interaction that we begin to experience with each other is crucial to our healing. As long as one person is able to hold that place of calm and resilience, other nervous systems will pick it up. So again, from Sarah Payton, it is important to remember that the presence of just one empathic and caring witness helps people to survive and to have reserves of self-regard to call upon for the rest of their lives. Anytime there are meaningful experiences of warmth and being understood, brains are reaching to build new, healthier connections in the fibers of attachment that run through the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala and to regulating the body. So I think we're learning here that relationship is a key. So if we bring this idea of relationship back into the healing process, then we want to look at the varieties of ways that can happen, which is what we're going to do right now. So first of all, we have relationship to self. And that means that when there's a part of ourself that is feeling anxious, the more we can connect into the part of ourself is able to witness or hold presence or be neutral or non-judgmental. We're able to hold that part of ourself, the anxious part of ourself, with compassion. That enables that part of ourself to heal. So that might be one of the reasons why people find that MDMA is such a powerful psychedelic, which it isn't, but an empathogen for helping this healing happen, is that it enables us to access more of this compassionate part of self to bring to other parts of self that are more wounded. So parts of self need to be held in compassionate self-regard. And I would recommend again that Your Resonant Self by Sarah Payton is one of the best books to read on that particular topic. So, simultaneously, if we're able to hold our own nervous system, so be able to become aware that our nervous system is beginning to get hyper aroused, and we can bring that positive, compassionate self-regard to the awareness of our nervous system, we can then begin to hold ourselves in compassion, hold our nervous system in compassion, and then begin to settle down in. So whenever we're bringing compassion or loving attunement to our own self, we're going to experience a level of healing. And finally, we have the transpersonal. So we can draw on archetypal images that come into our journeys. We can call on our spiritual beings or angels of light or God presence or whatever we want to call it. We can call and bring on those transpersonal resources into our own personality systems and into our own traumatized bodies. And that can help our bodies heal, settle and heal. However, what happens if we add an empathically attuned relationship to the work that we're already doing, even on psychedelics? So in this way, I'm talking about we might bring in a compassionate guide who can be witness, neutral, caring for what it is, whatever it is that we're experiencing on our journey. Another way this can happen is in couple work, where one couple can witness with empathic presence and non-judgmental acceptance what's happening for a partner. We can see this in friendship, and we can create it in groups. So empathic attunement to the needs and feelings of others in groups, as well as larger groups of community. And I think this is the cutting edge work that we're embarking on in our culture. So why do we need to bring psychedelics into this if this relatedness is so powerful in and of itself? The ego that we've developed to defend against the pain of what it was like to not get what we needed as little children, this ego actually creates a very defensive and strong wall. It's very hard to get through that wall, and especially the way therapy is set up these days with our sessions, there's not a whole lot of time for this wall to relax. So psychedelics is one of the fastest, quickest ways to get through the defensive wall. The default mode network. So any of our default mode network, which is the place in the brain that is the identity or houses the ego, when we've been traumatized as children, this default mode network develops what Sarah Payton then calls a savage attribute. So it isn't just a default mode, a normal, regular default mode. It's actually a savage default mode because it is filled with self-hatred and criticism. So most of us who are walking around with early developmental trauma, we resort and fall back into a default mode that is very critical, full of shame, self-loathing, and that is what she terms the savage default mode network. Psychedelics can help begin to break up the default mode in our system so we can begin to experience something else. I did a whole other presentation previously on this savage default mode and what we need to do to begin to bring awareness to it. So existential issues on the transpersonal end, but basically feelings of lack of belonging, of meaning, of mattering, all those things are so abstract and vague. The ego can't even begin to comprehend what that is, and we cannot instill that into our being without the help of something that is going to dissolve that wall, that defensive wall. That was my very first MDMA experience, was when I felt for the first time what it felt like to belong. And I had not felt that all my whole life. It always felt like I didn't belong. So that sense of belonging that just came naturally with the help of that medicine. Basically, we're needing to find a way to get underneath the conscious mind. We need to find a way to get at birth. So prenatal, perinatal, early preverbal is mostly untouchable. And we know that many medicines can help us get there. I have had very powerful experiences on ibogaine with working through birth trauma. And our internalized beliefs need new patterning. We can do what we can do from a mental perspective, but it's very, very difficult to get to the full depth of the repatterning that needs to happen. So that's why we need to bring psychedelics into the picture. So what we're basically doing now is we're adding psychedelics to an empathic, attuned relationship. This is going to be a winning combo. So how do we do that? If we're working individually, doing our own journey, which is what many of us do, we want to just simply bring in an attuned empathic friend, or we can bring in an attuned empathic guide, a professional person. Another way that, if you haven't already considered this, is to bring in a team of guides. So I really, really like this as an approach. So what about if we set up individual sessions or individual journeys where we had 2 or 3 or 4 of our friends, or we had a few professionals and a few friends all coming together to hold us in that space? Then we're looking at deep trauma work, and we're able to combine, maybe one person is holding, one person is singing, one person who might be the professional shaman might be doing the soul retrieval. Then we have somebody else doing energetic work, and then we have sound healing. So let's bring all of this together. Of course, secondly, then we can work with a therapist or a shaman for the purpose of specifically working with the nervous system in a very, very specific and titrated way. So this would be an example of a therapist might be able to work with somebody on a regular dose of MDMA, for example, but this very specific intention of working on attachment. So we might be working with eye contact, might be working with touch, might be working with holding, might be helping the person to regulate their nervous system, or we may be going into a past life recall. And then, of course, we can access in spirit helpers and spirit guides. And if we bring in a shaman to work with us, we can work on the levels of soul retrieval and extractions, or the release of negative energies. Couples. So couples working together with MDMA on your own, that is a way, as long as there's enough trust embedded in the relationship already, that is a really beautiful way to do your work with another human being. And again, there should not be any major issues in the relationship, because if there are major issues in the relationship, then we need to skip down, and that needs to be done with a therapist, a trained therapist, for safety. Because I find that many couples who are working, so what's happening in couple relationships are the couples are projecting their unresolved stuff on the other. Sometimes it's better to have one person in the coupledom work separately first on their own issues and then come together as a couple. Sometimes it's better to work as a couple first and then have the people separate and do their own work. So that is something that I notice just happens intuitively. It's like the right way to work with couple and therapist presents itself during the process. Now, more of the cutting edge, but this is where we're getting to therapy and support groups. So here we get to experience in a safe environment with a skilled facilitator what it would feel like to actually have less ego defenses involved in interactions with each other from the heart without those ego defenses in place. Very, very powerful way of working. As long as the guidelines are set up for safety and there's a skilled facilitator, this is a very, very powerful way of working with medicines in group. So here's a quote: MDMA has the capacity so much more than all the other drugs to provide focused and effective psychotherapy that gets to the root, to the core wound, and to the trauma. And the beautiful thing about working with MDMA is that it can be done in so many different ways that you can use it intentionally, as I mentioned before, to work with attachment issues or relationship issues with a skilled therapist. Or it can be used as it's done in a lot of the clinical trials where it's more standoff. So there's many ways of working with this medicine. Carl Rogers has claimed that therapeutic groups may be the most beneficial invention of the 20th century. And I have not known a more effective form of group psychotherapy than the skillful use of MDMA. So this is a quote by Claudio Naranjo, many, many years ago, who was exploring this arena. This is not new, but it, of course, because of the legal issues, became less and less accessible. And he also went on to say MDMA supports the progression from defensive accusation toward an understanding of others. Here are some of the models that, if you're not familiar with them, most of these are not psychedelic models of doing therapy, but all of these are very powerful models for working with early developmental trauma. We have the sensorimotor of Pat Ogden, internal family systems, somatic experiencing, NARM, which we saw before. This book is an excellent one by Sharon Stanley, Relational and Body-Centered Practices for Healing Trauma. Of course, there's the transpersonal work of Stan Groff and the holotropic work, which includes holding and breath work. So again, the holding and the touch is very important. And I don't know whether you all are familiar with, we're gonna not do very much on this psycholytic. It's not being used very much, but anaclytic was a form of therapy that was being done in the day before LSD was illegal, and it was a very powerful way of working with early infantile developmental trauma. So anaclytic therapy with LSD, based on the work of Joyce Martin and Pauline McCrurick, whereby the therapists would hold their clients in a variety of levels of infantile positions, from caressing, reassuring touch, holding their heads, hugging, rocking, to lying on a couch with full body contact. The subjective reports were said to be remarkable. People were really concerned that people would become dependent, and that is not what they found out. They actually supported more independence because those needs were being met. Okay, so I have a number of, I am realizing we're getting up to, well, it's been maybe about 50 minutes. I want to give some case examples. I had always functioned from a place of fear. I don't ever remember feeling safe here. My mother had been narcissistic and worked from the first month after my birth. I never bonded with her and never felt any form of loving nurturance. During a journey with my boyfriend, the mushrooms enabled me to experience a profound sense of safety in my body, one that I'd never felt before. I wanted to read this account, which, so this, Carl, with permission, gave me permission to share this. So basically, we had been working together, prepping him for his work with MDMA, and we decided to go ahead that he would just take the MDMA on his own, and then he would come to my office and we'd do some work together. So that's essentially what we did. So Carl is a successful professional who describes his parents as people who provided for his physical and material needs without warmth or sustained sense of nurturance. With no overt abuse, he had always thought his family was normal and there should be nothing wrong with him. He realized that he had problems because he couldn't seem to get his intimacy needs met in relationships. When I first saw him, the issues were fear of intimacy and underlying core anxiety. He says, my parents did everything right. They were very involved. However, they were emotionally neglectful. Over time, I've realized that I'm skittish to get close, avoid conflict, and hold back emotionally. I abandoned myself as an adult. In relationships, I become afraid, anxious, and vigilant, frozen, guarded, and walled off. In general, I want to be emotionally more present and warm. I've gotten better, and I can still get better. So we did about 8 prep sessions. My focus was to help him build a larger ground of presence or self so he could fall back on. And his goal with working with the medicine was to practice being on his edge, to stay present rather than withdraw in his relationships. He took MDMA about an hour before he showed up at my office. We allowed 3 hours for processing. His friend drove him and he arranged to be picked up, but then this is what happened. So this is an example of what can happen on this medicine work. He started to face some deep abandonment issues. His body started to shake, his legs especially. He was shaking and stomping and saying, I hate this, I can't stand this, it hurts so much, I'm in so much pain. I told him he was doing it exactly right. His leg was jumping a lot and he was trembling. So I started to wonder if this was a terrified, abandoned young child. I carefully and slowly walked behind him to get a chair and let him know I was going to extend a touch. Then I told him I was going to touch his knee. I was gentle and gave him permission to tell me to stop if he wanted to. He told me to keep doing it. After a while, my touch seemed to calm him down, and he told me he really appreciated feeling my hand on his knee, which brought up a cascade of feelings about the lack of touch in his childhood. After about 10 minutes, I was wondering if I should keep my hand on his knee. And that's when he said that actually he felt it was very, very healing and he really was glad that I had done that. At that point, he was curious about exploring eye contact because he spent a lot of the session with closed eyes and was curious as to whether it was something we should explore or not. Would it be too much? I was needing a break, so I suggested that we explored after I got up for a minute to rest my back and get some tea. Me asking for a break brought on a cascade of uncomfortable feelings about me meeting my needs. And in his family, no one met their own needs. So issues around whether it was okay to meet needs, to be in relationship and meet his own needs were explored. He realized that because he had learned from his codependent parents that no one had needs, he believed that his needs were a burden. As I was getting myself some tea, he grappled for another 20 minutes with this idea that he could have needs and others could have needs. So this is the kind of work that we can do. I can go on and read more, but I think that's, because then we went on to work with eye contact. And we just I realized how important the work with touch could be, and titrating touch and titrating closeness, moving towards, moving away, and working with eye contact could be. Okay, let's skip that. Okay, so we then come to the aspect, we have some examples of groups and the use of these medicines in group work. I've seen it done 2 ways. I've seen it, of course, before COVID. I've seen it done where there was actually groups of women getting together and doing holding and snuggling and singing with each other. And then after COVID, some of the people that I was working with told me that they needed to actually create a safer way of doing it. So that what they did was they created a situation where they all stayed at home for social distance, and they all agreed to take the medicine at the same time, but they agreed to come together in the evening and to talk about intentions and work together and create that good relational community feel and be supportive of each other the day of. They met in the morning, they did ceremony together, they actually went through the day on their own in the medicine, in lower dose medicine journeys, and then they reconvened in the evening, again over Zoom, and then the next day they did some integration work together. So that was an example of how we could combine, even in this day and age, the use of these medicines in a safe way in community. One of my clients told me that she found out the Great Mother holds the wounds of humanity in her womb. Okay. We did this. Okay. So I'm just repeating this here. So I want to, this is the reason why we broke this up into two parts, but I do not want to end this without bringing back the context that I feel is really, really important. So we're going to just talk, I'm going to take maybe 5 more minutes and bring together and bring in this concept of soul. So the question that I started to ask myself, when psychedelics and psychological work isn't enough, what do we do? And how I came across this was actually something that happened to me in a journey. And it happened to me spontaneously, without thought that it would result in anything in particular. But it was a journey, it was a high dose journey that I went into with a very, very specific question. Because even though I had done all this work, I had all this somatic bonding, I had had all this deep healing in many areas of my lives. Remember, we talked about the lack of awareness. So there were still pockets of missing awareness that I wasn't aware of. But what I was aware of is something didn't feel completely right. So I went back into a high dose journey and I asked, okay, why? Like, what happened? Why, with all of this work that I've done, with the psychedelics that I've used, why is something still not feeling right? So I was reading this book, Other Lives, Other Selves. Actually, I'm skipping ahead. I shouldn't even be going there yet. I'm going to stay here. Because this is the work that we're actually going to focus on next time for the most part. But briefly, this is what we need to look at. And this is what's not being dealt with, as far as I can tell. And if anybody knows of people who are already doing this work in the context of serious psychological work, I would really like to hear about it. So when psychedelics and psychological work isn't enough, what do we need to start looking at? Wounded or lost souls, past life trauma, karmic vows made in other lifetimes or on other galactic dimensions, collective or ancestral wounding, disconnection from source, and what I'm calling evolutionary imperatives. So there's something that's also happening within the unfolding of our soul journey that's calling us forward towards something else. I'm going to skip ahead right here and just mention this briefly, that when I asked the right question, or when I was ready and I started to ask why, okay, I was aware of spiritual law. So I was aware, I don't know whether some of you are aware of this or not, but this was in my spiritual training, that like attracts like, that there is a cause and effect piece that's happening, that there is a way that my soul is calling towards me, to me, certain events in my life. And I wanted to find out what, if anything, attracted the situation of being born into a family with a narcissistic mother. And that was when I started to ask the question, why? Why did I attract that situation to me? Where did it come from, and what went wrong? And in that journey, I was given exactly the answers to those questions. And what I discovered was beyond anything that I could cognitively make sense of. I was afraid to speak about it to other people, but the reality of it was so tangible. And not only was the reality of the experience totality, but the results of the experience were tangible, and that I was able and began to regain capacities that I never knew I had. So again, talking about that lack of awareness, that sense of absence of awareness, there was a pocket of awareness of myself and my capacities that I, on some level, knew that I should have access to, but I never could connect with it. And after that session, and after I became aware of what happened, those capacities began to come back in and reveal themselves to me. This was not an intangible, abstract experience. This was a very tangible thing that began to happen in the very physical body that I lived in, and in the way that I worked with people, and the way that I then began to use myself in my relationships. So those capacities began to come in as soon as I made that connection, and I began to remember who I was. And it was in the remembering of who I was that for the first time I began to understand who I am as a human being, why I am a human being in this life, and what my life is about. That was when I went in and started to explore this idea of past life work. So there are these beautiful authors, there are these wonderful people that we can go back to. This is the quote I wanted to read, and I'm going to say this because this might be just where I leave you this evening. So Roger Wilder, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and I opened this book and read it, and I was blown away. From nearly a decade of taking clients and colleagues through past life experiences, and continuing my own personal explorations, I have come to regard this technique, past life recall, as one of the most concentrated and powerful tools available to psychotherapy, short of psychedelic drugs. So I went, okay, what would happen if we combine these two most powerful forms of psychotherapy, psychedelics and past life work? And what would happen if we actually combine them with the best of trauma therapies, which is relational and somatic work? So that's what I'm most interested in exploring, and that's what we'll be doing next time. I think I'm going to just end with this summary. So overview of what just went on this hour. We're wounded in relationship. We have to heal in relationship. An unconditionally loving presence in our life, whether it's a therapist, guide, partner, friend, creates the condition for optimal healing. The nervous system must be taught to relax so that all parts of the soul can begin to come in, right, into a safe internal container. And that the ecosystem of these protectors need to be understood, but also relaxed and dissolved so that the exiles and the other soul parts can come in. The trajectory of our own soul is unique. And this is incredibly important and has a path of its own, which is unlike anyone else's. So the more we come to understand our own soul path, the more likely we can understand and resolve the issues in this life. And the more we can bring acceptance and compassion, not only to our unique journey, but the journeys of others. Psychedelic, somatic, relational, and past life therapies, when combined, are a powerful container for change. Okay, so on my website, in the homepage, you can click on the psychedelic worksheets, and there is a couples workshop for couples therapy for couples who want to utilize MDMA in their therapeutic context. So there's a worksheet for that. There's also a worksheet on the use of past life work with MDMA and psilocybin. So to begin to look at and think about how can I bring that into my work with psychedelic therapies. And then there's the attachment, how to heal attachment wounds with psychedelics. So if you want to go in and take a look at those. Okay, upcoming August 6th, and I believe, Jason, we also have September 15th. We'll do some more work. I do regular nature and stay-at-home retreats, which are offered regularly throughout the year. So if you want to be part of that, really all you have to do is get on my psychedelic, sign up for the psychedelic worksheets, and you'll be in my email list for anything that I might be offering in the future. All right, I was going to have a colleague of mine share, but I'm thinking that we're just going to bring everybody back on. You can stop the recording, hopefully. I have been recording. I have no idea. I don't see it. Stop share. Maybe this
recording
never got
says
recorded.
it's on.
Oh, yeah.
No, the recording says it's on
recording.
Wow, great. It is recording. So we're going to stop the recording. Yeah.